The sound of a structural failure is never as loud as the movies make it out to be. There is no cinematic explosion, no rhythmic percussion of falling debris. Instead, it is a moan, a long, agonizing shriek of tortured steel that sounds more like a living creature being flayed alive than a piece of infrastructure giving way. Maya still heard it every time she closed her eyes. It was a frequency that lived in the marrow of her bones. 3 years ago, the St. Jude's Bridge had folded like a piece of wet cardboard into the icy currents of the river below. In the eyes of the public, the blame had been cast onto the youngest lead architect in the firm's history. Maya had been the face of the tragedy, her name dragged through the mud of every news cycle until she had no choice but to bury it. Now she lived in a city where no one knew her. She lived in a studio apartment that smelled of lemon floor wax and loneliness, working a job that required her to look at spreadsheets instead of blueprints. Numbers were safe. Numbers didn't collapse. Numbers didn't leave widows and widowers staring into the black water of a river. On a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, the phone on her desk rang. "Maya, it's Miller and Thorne. Legal." Maya felt her heart seize. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand tightening around her windpipe. It's happening again, she thought. Another lawsuit, another discovery phase, another year of being the villain. "I'm not there," she whispered to the empty room, before realizing she had already picked up. "Ms. Thorne would like you to come in, Maya." The voice on the other end was professional, devoid of the vitriol she usually expected from legal representatives. "It's not regarding the litigation. It's regarding a private matter. An inheritance." An inheritance. The word was absurd. Maya had no family left. Her parents had died long before the bridge took her career, and her siblings were non-existent. She spent the walk to the law firm counting her steps, a nervous habit that kept the panic at bay. 1,412 steps to the glass-fronted building. 18 steps into the elevator. The office of Miller and Thorne was a temple of mahogany and silence. When she was shown into the partner's office, the air felt thin, pressurized. "Sit down, Maya," the lawyer said. She was a woman who looked like she was carved from flint. She pushed a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the desk. "Do you remember a woman named Evelyn Blackwood?" The name stirred a ghost of a memory. Maya reached back through the fog of the last 3 years, past the depositions and the screaming headlines. She saw a rainy afternoon at a grocery store. An elderly woman had dropped a glass jar of peaches. The sound had sent Maya into a near panic attack, the shatter of glass too close to the sound of breaking concrete. But the woman hadn't been angry. She had looked at Maya with eyes that seemed to see right through the disgraced architect label and into the hollowed-out girl beneath. Maya had helped her. She had cleaned up the glass. She had walked the woman to her car, and when she realized the woman was shaking too hard to drive, she had sat with her for 2 hours in the parking lot, talking about nothing and everything. "I remember her," Maya said, her voice barely a thread. She was kind." "She was more than kind," the lawyer replied. "She was the owner of one of the largest coastal estates in Maine, and she passed away last month." Maya looked at the envelope. "I don't understand." "Evelyn Blackwood left you Blackwood Manor, the entire estate. The grounds, the private beach, the house itself." The room tilted. Maya gripped the arms of her chair. "Why? I was a stranger. I just gave her a ride home once." Evelyn's will was very specific. She said you were the only person who treated her like she was still there, rather than a ghost waiting to vanish, but... The lawyer paused, her expression darkening. "There is a condition, a significant one." Maya knew there would be a catch. The universe didn't give gifts to people like her. It only offered temporary reprieves. "The manor is in a state of advanced decay," the lawyer continued. "It hasn't been properly maintained in 20 years. To claim the inheritance, you must live in the house for 6 months. You must oversee the restoration of the main hall and the library, and you must do it with a co-owner." "A co-owner?" Maya asked. "Who?" The lawyer hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of genuine pity crossed her face. "His name is Caleb Vance. He's the widower of Sarah Vance." The name hit Maya like a physical blow. Sarah Vance, the kindergarten teacher, the woman who had been in the third car on the bridge, the woman whose husband had stood on the banks of the river for 3 days, refusing to leave until they pulled her body from the wreckage. "No!" Maya gasped, standing up so quickly her chair skidded back against the carpet. "No, that's cruel. He hates me. He should hate me." "He was already informed," the lawyer said quietly. "He has already moved into the house. He's waiting for you, Maya. Evelyn left the house to both of you. If either of you leaves before the 6 months are up, the estate is sold, and the proceeds go to the very firm that defended the contractors who cut the corners on your bridge." Maya felt the air leave her lungs. It was a trap, a beautiful, horrific architectural trap. She could either face the man who represented her greatest failure, or she could let the people who truly killed Sarah Vance profit from her death. The drive to Maine took 7 hours. The further north Maya went, the more the world seemed to bleed of color, fading into shades of granite, pine, and slate. By the time she reached the coast, the air smelled of salt and rot, the scent of the ocean reclaiming the land. Blackwood Manor sat on a jagged tooth of rock overlooking the Atlantic. It was a Victorian monstrosity, a sprawling skeleton of graying wood and broken glass. It looked like a shipwreck that had crawled out of the sea and died on the cliffside. The ivy that climbed its walls wasn't decorative. It looked like it was trying to pull the building back into the earth. Maya's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. She could see a single light flickering in a ground-floor window. She killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, distant thud of the waves against the base of the cliff. Thump, thump, like a heartbeat. She stepped out of the car. The wind caught her hair, whipping it across her face. The cold was different here. It was wet, biting through her thin coat. She walked toward the front door, her boots crunching on the gravel of a driveway that had long since been overtaken by weeds. The front door was massive, carved from dark oak that had bleached to the color of bone. She didn't have to knock. The door creaked open before her hand could touch the wood. The foyer was a cavern of shadows. The air inside was colder than the air outside, smelling of damp wool, sawdust, and the sharp metallic tang of sea salt. A single lamp sat on a crate in the center of the room, casting long, distorted shadows up the grand staircase. And there, standing in the periphery of the light, was a man. He was taller than he had looked in the newspapers. He was wearing a heavy flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms covered in dust and old scars. His hair was a dark, unkempt mess, and his beard was thick, hiding the lines of a face that should have been in its prime but looked ancient. But it was his eyes that stopped Maya in her tracks. They weren't angry. Anger was hot. Anger was a fire you could fight. His eyes were cold. They were the color of the river on the day the bridge fell. "You're late," Caleb said. His voice was a low rasp, the sound of stones grinding together. He didn't move toward her. He stayed in the shadows, a sentinel of grief. The traffic," Maya stammered. She hated how small she sounded. She was an architect. She was a professional. But standing in front of him, she felt like the 24-year-old girl who had watched her world turn to rubble in a single afternoon. Caleb stepped into the light. The glow of the lamp hit the wedding ring he still wore on his left hand. It caught the light, a tiny, defiant spark of gold in the gloom. "The lawyer told you the rules?" he asked. "Yes," Maya said. 6 months. We restore the hall and the library." "I don't want your help," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. "I don't want to speak to you. I don't want to see you. But I will not let those bastards have this house, do you understand?" "I understand," Maya said, her voice finally finding a bit of steel. "I don't want them to have it either." "Good." Caleb turned away, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Your room is at the top of the stairs, second door on the left. Don't go into the right wing, that's mine." "Caleb," she called out, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. He stopped, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "about Sarah." I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Caleb's shoulders tensed. For a moment she thought he might break, that he might turn around and finally scream at her, vent the 3 years of agony he'd been carrying. But he didn't. "Don't say her name," he said, so softly she almost missed it. "You don't get to say her name." He walked into the darkness of the kitchen and the door clicked shut behind him. Maya stood alone in the center of the decaying foyer. She looked up at the ceiling. High above, hidden in the shadows of the rafters, she could see the cracks. The house was shifting, groaning under its own weight. It was a masterpiece of structural instability. She reached out and touched the wall. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing the lath and plaster beneath. It felt like a rib cage. She wasn't just here to restore a house. She was here to live inside a wound. Maya picked up her suitcase and began the long climb up the stairs. Every step creaked, a rhythmic warning. Go back, go back, go back. But she didn't go back. She couldn't. When she reached the second floor, she found her room. It was sparse. A bed with a moth-eaten quilt, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the cliff's edge. She didn't turn on the light. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. Somewhere below, she heard the rhythmic sound of a hammer. Clang, clang, clang. Caleb was working. Even in the middle of the night, even in the dark, he was trying to beat the decay into submission. Maya lay back, her coat still on. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, the sound of the bridge was replaced by something else. It was the sound of the ocean, relentless and uncaring, slowly eating away at the rock beneath them. She was in the house of the man who hated her most in the world, surrounded by the ghosts of a woman she barely knew, and a woman she had inadvertently killed. The 6 months had begun. As she drifted into a fitful sleep, the last thing she saw was the dust motes dancing in the moonlight, settling on everything like a shroud. This was the inheritance of broken things, and she had no idea how to fix any of it. The next morning, the reality of Blackwood Manor was even more daunting in the cold light of a Maine dawn. Maya woke up to the smell of damp earth and old chimneys. She made her way downstairs, her footsteps echoing through the hollow shell of the house. She found Caleb in the kitchen. He was drinking coffee from a chipped mug, staring out at the fog that had rolled in from the sea. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't even blink. On the kitchen table, he had laid out a set of tools. They were old but meticulously cared for. A chisel, a plane, a heavy-duty crowbar. Beside them was a stack of Post-it notes. He picked one up, wrote something on it, and slapped it onto the table before walking out the back door. Maya picked it up. Library, floorboards, start at the north wall. No good morning. No, let's talk about the plan. Just in order. Maya felt a flare of irritation, followed immediately by a crushing weight of guilt. She had no right to be irritated. She walked into the library. The room was magnificent, even in its ruin. It was 2 stories tall, with a mezzanine reached by a spiral staircase that looked like it would collapse if a bird landed on it. Thousands of books remained on the shelves, their spines rotted by the humidity, their pages fused together by time. The floor was the priority. The oak planks were warped, bowing upward like the hull of a sunken ship. Maya knelt on the floor. She took the crowbar Caleb had left for her. She jammed the tip into a gap between the boards and heaved. The wood screamed. She worked for hours. Her hands, soft from years of office work, began to blister. The dust settled in her throat, making her cough. Every time she pulled up a board, she found more rot. The joists beneath were black and soft to the touch. "You're doing it wrong." She jumped, the crowbar clattering to the floor. Caleb was standing in the doorway. He was covered in gray dust, his face a mask of exhaustion. "I'm following your note," Maya said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of a dirty hand. "You're using too much leverage," he said, walking toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing right over her. He smelled of cedar and old sweat. "You're going to snap the joist. If the joist goes, the whole section collapses." "I know how structures work, Caleb." she said, her voice trembling. I was an architect. You were an architect who didn't look at the foundations, he snapped. The words were a physical strike. Maya flinched. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't meant to say it, or perhaps as if he had meant to say much more. He reached down, his hand hovering near hers for a fraction of a second before he grabbed the crowbar. His skin was rough, his knuckles swollen. He positioned the tool with a surgical precision she wouldn't have expected from a man of his size. "Watch," he commanded. He applied pressure, not in one burst, but in a slow, steady rhythm. The board gave way with a resigned sigh rather than a snap. "Respect the wood," he said, handing the tool back to her. "It's been here for 100 years. It doesn't want to leave." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "There's a leak in the pantry. I'll be there if the ceiling starts to come down." "Caleb?" He didn't stop. "Why stay?" she asked. "The lawyer said you could have walked away. You have a life. You had a job. Why come here with me?" Caleb paused. He looked around the ruined library, his gaze lingering on a velvet armchair in the corner that was now home to a family of mice. "Because I have nowhere else to go, Maya," he said. "The world is full of people who want to tell me how to grieve. They want me to move on. They want me to be a survivor." He looked back at her, and for a fleeting second the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a raw, bleeding vacancy. "In this house everything is already dead. It's the only place I can breathe." He left her then, the sound of his heavy boots fading into the distance of the hallway. Maya stayed on her knees. She looked at the board he had removed. Beneath it, in the dark space between the floors, she saw something glinting. She reached in, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out. It was a small brass key, attached to a tag that had faded to a ghostly white. On it, in elegant, spindly handwriting, were 2 words. "The Garden." Maya looked at the key, then at the door where Caleb had disappeared. She felt a strange, terrifying pull. This house wasn't just a project. It was a labyrinth of secrets, and she was trapped in its center with a man who was using the ruins to build a fortress around his heart. She pocketed the key, picked up the crowbar, and went back to work. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the floorboards. Outside, the tide was coming in. The ocean was rising. In the pantry, she heard the sound of water hitting a bucket. Plink, plink, plink. In the library, she heard the sound of wood being pried from its home. Kurak, kurak. They were working in parallel, 2 ghosts in a dying house, trying to find a way to stand on a foundation that had already fallen. The first week at Blackwood Manor was not defined by conversations, but by the absence of them. The silence was not a void. It was a pressurized substance, a thick, invisible fog that filled the hallways and settled into the corners of every room. It was a silence that carried the weight of everything they weren't saying. The screams of the bridge, the names of the dead, the sheer, impossible absurdity of their proximity. Maya's days began at 5 a.m., when the gray Atlantic light was just beginning to bruise the horizon. The house was at its coldest then, the thermal mass of the stone walls having surrendered the previous day's meager warmth hours ago. She would descend the grand staircase, her breath blooming in front of her like a small white ghost, and find the kitchen table. There, sitting exactly where it had been the day before, would be the stack of yellow Post-it notes. Beside it, a single mug of black coffee, still steaming. Caleb was always gone by then, already lost in the bowels of the house or out on the cliffside assessing the erosion. She picked up the top note. The handwriting was aggressive, the ink pressing so hard into the paper that it left an indentation on the sheets beneath. Mezzanine railing is loose. Do not lean. Start on the water damage in the west alcove. Don't touch the mahogany blocks on my workbench. Maya stared at the note until the words blurred. It was an order, a boundary, and a warning all at once. She reached for the coffee. It was bitter, scorched, and exactly how she felt. She didn't use gloves. She had found a pair in the mudroom, thick leather things that would have saved her skin, but she had left them hanging on their peg. She wanted to feel the grit. She wanted the splinters. Every sting was a distraction from the larger, more tectonic ache in her chest. She spent the next 4 hours in the library alcove. The water damage was extensive. A leak in the slate roof had allowed 30 years of Maine winters to seep into the lath and plaster. As she scraped away the sodden remains of what had once been a decorative molding, the smell hit her. The cloying, sweet rot of ancient damp. It was the smell of something that had been forgotten and left to die. Just like me, she thought, her scraper catching on a rusted nail. The nail shrieked as it was pulled from the wood. The sound was high and sharp, and for a split second Maya wasn't in a library in Maine. She was back on the bridge. She heard the snap of the suspension cables, that sound like a gunshot echoing over the water. She felt the sudden sickening drop of the world beneath her feet. She dropped the scraper. Her hands were shaking, the blood from a fresh blister smearing across the silver tool. "I told you to be careful with the lath." Maya gasped, spinning around. Caleb was standing at the base of the spiral staircase. He was holding a heavy beam across his shoulders, the muscles in his neck corded with the effort. He looked like an atlas carved from granite and resentment. He didn't come closer. He just watched her from the shadows of the lower shelves. "I'm being careful," Maya said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast, hollow room. "You're rushing," Caleb said. He dropped the beam with a deafening thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Maya flinched, her eyes darting to the ceiling as if expecting the rafters to come down. Caleb noticed the flinch. His jaw tightened. "The house isn't going to fall, Maya, at least not today. But if you keep hacking at that plaster like it's an enemy, you're going to compromise the decorative header behind it." "I know how to strip a wall, Caleb," she snapped, the irritation finally bubbling past her guilt. "I've overseen projects 10 times the size of this house. And how many of them stayed up?" The silence that followed was different from the morning silence. This was a jagged thing, a blade held to a throat. Maya felt the color drain from her face. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had signed the final approval for the St. Jude's Bridge, the hands that were now covered in the dust of a dying house. Caleb stepped into the light. He looked at her hands, his eyes lingering on the raw red skin of her palms. He didn't offer a bandage. He didn't offer pity. "You think this is penance," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You think if you work until you bleed, it changes anything. It doesn't. You're just making a mess of my floor." He turned and began to haul the beam toward the far wall. Maya watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was right. And that was the part that hurt the most. This wasn't just a restoration. It was an exorcism. And he was the priest who hated the demon he was trying to cast out. By the 3rd week, the architecture of spite had reached a rhythmic equilibrium. They communicated almost entirely through the post-its. "Maya, the copper flashing on the north chimney is gone. It needs to be replaced before the next rain. Caleb, I know, don't tell me what I already know. Maya, we are running low on structural adhesive. Caleb, there's a list on the fridge. Add it." The fridge became a neutral territory, a white plastic monolith where their needs intersected. Milk, eggs, nails, sandpaper. They ate at different times. Maya would eat a bowl of cereal standing at the counter at midnight. Caleb would eat a sandwich in the basement at noon. They moved through the house like 2 ships avoiding a collision in the dark, their paths dictated by the sound of the other's footsteps. Maya found herself becoming an expert on the sounds of Caleb Vance. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his work boots meant he was in the hall. The sharp, erratic clack-clack of the chisel meant he was working on the library's intricate woodwork, a task he refused to let her touch. And then there was the silence. The long, terrifying stretches of silence when he would go to the cliff's edge and simply stand there, looking out at the water, where the sun hit the waves. During one of those silences, Maya went back to the library. She felt the brass key in her pocket, the one she had found under the floorboards. She had spent nights lying awake, wondering what had opened. Evelyn Blackwood had been a woman of secrets, and this house was her labyrinth. She began to search the library for a lock. She checked the antique cabinets, the locked grills of the rare book section, even the base of the statues that stood in the corners. Nothing. The key remained a cold weight against her thigh. She moved to the mahogany desk in the center of the room. It was a massive piece of furniture scarred by time and ink. As she ran her fingers along the underside of the drawer, she felt a slight indentation, a hidden catch. She pressed it. A small concealed panel on the side of the desk clicked open. Inside wasn't a lock, but a photograph. It was an old Polaroid, the edges yellowed with age. It showed a younger Evelyn, her face radiant, standing in front of the manor. Beside her was a man with a kind face and hands that looked like they knew the weight of a hammer. But it was the background that caught Maya's breath. Behind them, the garden was in full, glorious bloom. It wasn't the tangled, skeletal mess it was now. It was a riot of color: roses, hydrangeas, lavender. And in the center of the garden was a small stone structure, a gazebo, or perhaps a shrine. Maya looked at the key. The garden. "What are you doing?" She jumped, nearly dropping the photograph. Caleb was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He had a crowbar in one hand, and for a terrifying second, he looked like the incarnation of the house's own rage. I was just looking for the adhesive," Maya lied, her heart racing. She slid the photograph back into the hidden compartment and snapped it shut. Caleb walked into the room. He didn't believe her. He could smell the lie like he could smell the rot in the walls. He stopped inches from the desk, his presence overwhelming. "The adhesive is in the pantry," he said. "I told you that on the note." "I forgot," she said, backing away. Caleb's gaze fell on her hand, which was still hovering near the hidden catch. He looked at her, and then at the desk. He didn't ask what she had found. He didn't care about the secrets of the dead. He only cared about the intrusion of the living. "We need supplies," he said abruptly. "The truck is loaded. We're going into town." Town? Maya felt a cold spike of dread. The local town, Oakhaven, was small. It was a place where everyone knew everyone and everyone knew exactly who she was. "Can't you just go? I have work to do on the alcove." "I need someone to help load the lumber," Caleb said, his voice flat. "And the lawyer called. The contractors for the resort were seen taking photos of the property line this morning. We need to be seen, Maya. We need the town to know we're actually doing the work, or the firm will find a way to claim abandonment." Maya realized she didn't have a choice. This was part of the penance. She had to face the world she had broken. Oakhaven was a town built of gray shingle and grit. It clung to the coastline like a barnacle, weathered by the salt and the cynicism of a place that had seen its best days half a century ago. As Caleb's battered truck rumbled down the main street, Maya felt every eye on them. It wasn't her imagination. People stopped on the sidewalks. A fisherman mending a net outside the bait shop looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the woman in the passenger seat. Caleb pulled up in front of Henderson's Hardware. "Stay close," he said. It wasn't a gesture of protection. It was a command. The interior of the hardware store smelled of kerosene and sawdust. An old man with a face like a topographical map was standing behind the counter. This was Henderson. He looked at Caleb with a nod of respect, then his gaze shifted to Maya. The silence that fell over the store was instantaneous. Two other customers, men in heavy work jackets, turned around. "Caleb," Henderson said, his voice like gravel. "Didn't expect to see you in here with company. I need 12-foot tube tins, pressure-treated, and 3 rolls of flashing," Caleb said, ignoring the tension. Henderson didn't move. He leaned over the counter, his eyes fixed on Maya. "You've got a lot of nerve, lady, coming back to this part of the world. My nephew was on that bridge. He's in a wheelchair now. Because of design efficiencies." The words felt like stones being thrown at her. Maya looked at the floor, the patterns in the linoleum blurring. I'm so sorry for your nephew," she whispered. "Sorry doesn't fix a spine," one of the other men spat. He stepped forward, his face flushed with a sudden, sharp anger. "You architects, you sit in your air-conditioned offices and draw lines on paper, And when people die, you just sign a different paper and move on. You're a murderer. That's what you are. Maya felt the panic rising, a cold wave crashing over her head. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the store seemed to be closing in, the ceiling sagging under the weight of their hatred. She turned to run, to get back to the truck, back to the safety of the decaying house. But a hand caught her arm. It wasn't one of the townsfolk. It was Caleb. His grip was firm, his fingers locking around her wrist with the strength of a vice. He didn't look at her. He looked straight at Henderson. "That's enough," Caleb said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a vibration that silenced the room. "You're defending her, Caleb?" Henderson asked, his voice full of disbelief. "After what she did to Sarah? After what she took from you?" Caleb's face didn't change. It remained a mask of cold, hard glass. "She's the co-owner of Blackwood," Caleb said. "And she's the one who knows how to keep the roof from caving in on my head. If you want to talk about Sarah, you talk to me. But if you want to talk about the bridge, you talk to the lawyers. Right now, I'm a customer. Do you want my money? Or do I take it to the big box store in Portland?" Henderson stared at Caleb for a long beat. The tension in the room was a physical cord, stretched to the point of snapping. Finally, Henderson looked away. "The lumber's in the yard," he grumbled. "Go load it yourself." Caleb didn't let go of Maya's arm until they were back outside, standing in the salt-stiffened air of the lumber yard. He released her so abruptly it felt like a rejection. "I didn't ask you to do that," Maya said, her voice shaking. "I didn't do it for you," Caleb said, his back to her as he began to heave a massive plank of wood onto the truck bed. "I did it because I hate a lynch mob, and because if you have a panic attack and drive into a ditch, I'm the one who has to explain it to the lawyers. Now pick up the other end of this beam." They worked in silence, the physical labor providing a brutal sort of clarity. Maya's muscles screamed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she didn't complain. She welcomed the pain. It was the only thing that felt honest. As they drove back to Blackwood, the sky began to turn a bruised, sickly purple. The wind was picking up, the trees along the road bowing in a frantic, synchronized dance. "Nor'easter's coming," Caleb muttered. "How bad?" "Bad enough. The house has a few holes we haven't patched yet. We're going to have a long night." The storm hit at 9 p.m. It started with a low, mournful howl that vibrated through the chimneys. Then came the rain. Not a drizzle, but a horizontal assault that lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel. Blackwood Manor began to groan. It was the sound of 1,000 joints protesting, the old wood expanding and contracting as the barometric pressure plummeted. To anyone else, it was just the sound of an old house. To Maya, it was the sound of a structural failure in progress. She was in her room huddled under the quilt when she heard the sound. Crack. It wasn't a branch, it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a structural member failing. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing her flashlight. She ran into the hallway, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. She met Caleb at the top of the stairs. He was already dressed in his yellow slicker, his face grim. "The library?" she asked. "The library," he confirmed. They ran down the stairs. When they opened the library doors, the sound was deafening. The wind was whistling through the gaps in the ceiling where the slate had been compromised. Water was pouring in, a dark, shimmering curtain that was drenching the books and the newly exposed floorboards. But that wasn't the problem. One of the secondary support beams, the one Caleb had been working on, had shifted. The temporary shoring had buckled under the weight of the water-saturated roof. The beam was hanging at a precarious angle, held up by nothing but a single, overstressed bolt. "If that beam goes, the whole north corner of the roof follows it," Maya shouted over the roar of the wind. "I have to jack it up," Caleb yelled back. "I need you to hold the ladder. In this wind, you'll fall." "We don't have a choice, Maya. Hold the damn ladder." Caleb dragged the heavy extension ladder to the center of the room. He positioned it against a solid section of the wall, but the floor was slick with water and plaster dust. The base of the ladder kept sliding. Maya threw herself against the base. She planted her feet, her weight bearing down with everything she had. "Go!" she screamed. Caleb began to climb. He was carrying a hydraulic jack and a short piece of timber. The ladder swayed with every step. Maya could feel the vibrations through her arms, the terrifying rhythmic oscillation of a structure under too much stress. She looked up. Caleb was 30 feet above her, silhouetted against the dark, swirling chaos of the ceiling. The wind caught his slicker, snapping it like a sail. "Caleb, watch the shift," she warned. She could see it happening. The roof was twisting. The load was moving from the failed beam to the ladder itself. "I've got it," Caleb shouted. He reached the top. He wedged the timber into place and began to pump the jack. The ladder groaned. Maya felt the base slip an inch, then two. "Caleb, it's sliding." She threw her entire body over the bottom rung, her face pressed against the cold, wet metal. She could feel the heat radiating from her own skin, the desperation of her grip. "Don't let go." Caleb's voice was different now. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. "I won't," she promised. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, not again. Don't let someone else fall because of me." For several agonizing minutes, the world was nothing but the sound of the rain and the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of the jack. Then a new sound, a solid, deep thunk. The beam had settled. The weight was back where it belonged. The ladder stabilized. Maya felt the tension bleed out of the metal. A moment later, Caleb was descending, his movements slow and shaky. When his feet finally hit the floor, he didn't move. He stayed on the bottom rung, his forehead resting against the ladder. He was drenched, gasping for air, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them into his armpits. Maya stepped back, her own breath coming in ragged sobs. She looked at her hands. They were white, the knuckles bruised, the skin shredded by the grip she'd held on the metal. They stood there in the dark, the water swirling around their ankles, the storm raging outside. For the first time in 3 years, they were in the same space, facing the same disaster, and no one had died. Caleb looked up. The light from Maya's flashlight hit his face. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a villain, not as a ghost, but as a person who had just saved his life. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was hollow. "You didn't let go," he whispered. "I couldn't," Maya said. Caleb took a step toward her. The water splashed between them. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder. For a second, Maya thought he might touch her, that the architecture of spite might finally crumble. But then he froze. His gaze moved past her, toward the door of the library. In the flickering light of the storm, a shadow moved. It was a piece of fabric, a light floral scarf that had been caught in the draft of the open window. It fluttered for a moment, looking like a woman standing in the doorway watching them. Caleb's expression shattered. The coldness returned, harder and sharper than before. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Go to bed, Maya," he said, his voice a dead thing. "Caleb, we need to dry this floor or—" "I said go to bed," he roared, the sound echoing through the house like a cannon shot. He turned away from her, grabbing a bucket and beginning to bail the water with a frantic, desperate energy. He wasn't fighting the storm anymore. He was fighting the memory. Maya backed out of the room. She retreated into the hallway, her heart cold. She had seen it in his eyes. For 1 second, he had forgotten to hate her, and he would never ever forgive himself for that. As she climbed the stairs, she felt the brass key in her pocket. It felt heavier than ever. She reached the top of the stairs and looked back down into the darkness of the foyer. The house was still standing. The roof was secure, but the foundation, the invisible foundation between the two people inside, had just developed a crack that no amount of plaster could ever fill. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside Blackwood Manor, the real winter was just beginning. The morning after the storm, the world was a study in bruised silver. The nor'easter had moved out to sea, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. The air inside Blackwood Manor was thick and cool, smelling of ozone, damp slate, and the metallic tang of the harbor. Maya woke with her muscles locked in a state of permanent tension. Her hands were stiff, the skin on her palms tight and angry where she had gripped the ladder. She lay in the dim light of her room, watching the shadows of the pine trees dance against the peeling wallpaper. For the first time since she had arrived, the sound of the ocean didn't sound like a collapse. It sounded like a pulse. She made her way downstairs, her footsteps light on the stairs. She expected the kitchen to be empty, expected the usual yellow square of paper to be waiting like a cold command. But when she entered the room, she found the kitchen empty of both Caleb and his notes. Instead, sitting in the center of the scarred wooden table, was a small, round green tin. It was unlabeled, the lid slightly tarnished. Beside it lay a clean strip of white linen. Maya stood still, the refrigerator humming a low, mechanical tune in the corner. She looked at the tin, then at the back door. Through the window she could see the silhouette of the truck, but no sign of Caleb. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the tin. The scent of beeswax, calendula, and something sharp and medicinal, eucalyptus, filled the air. It was a healing salve. It was old world, hand-poured, and it was a peace offering that required no words. She sat at the table and began to rub the wax into her shredded palms. The sting was immediate, followed by a cooling, numbing sensation that made her eyes sting. He had seen her. He had seen the damage she had accepted as her due, and he had decided in the dark hours of the morning that she had bled enough. She wrapped her hands in the linen, the fabric soft and smelling of lavender. It was the first act of care she had received in 3 years that didn't feel like an insult. The library was a disaster zone, but a stable one. The ceiling was held fast by the hydraulic jack, a temporary iron spine in the room's wooden ribcage. Maya spent the morning moving the drenched books. Many were ruined, their pages swollen into thick blocks of pulp, but she handled each one as if it were a relic. As she moved a stack of Victorian encyclopedias near the window, she saw it. The floral scarf. It was draped over the arm of the velvet chair where the mice lived. In the chaos of the storm, she hadn't realized how it had gotten there. It was silk patterned with faded cornflowers. Sarah's scarf. The object that had acted as a spectral barrier between her and Caleb the night before. Maya reached out, her bandaged hand hovering over the fabric. She shouldn't touch it. It was a holy thing, a piece of a life she had helped extinguish. But the silk was damp, spotted with rainwater. If she left it there, the mold would claim it. She picked it up. It was impossibly light, a sigh of a thing. She carried it to the kitchen, draped it over the wooden drying rack by the stove, and carefully smoothed out the wrinkles. She didn't hide it. She didn't tuck it away in a drawer. She gave it the sun. "What are you doing?" Caleb's voice was like a sudden drop in temperature. He was standing in the doorway, his boots covered in mud, a heavy coil of rope over his shoulder. His eyes went immediately to the scarf, then to Maya's bandaged hands. "It was wet," Maya said, her heart hammering. "I didn't want the silk to rot." Caleb walked toward the stove. He looked at the scarf, the blue flowers bright in the morning light. His face was a landscape of conflicting shadows. Maya braced herself for the roar, for the "don't touch her things" that she knew was coming. But Caleb didn't roar. He reached out and touched the edge of the fabric with a single calloused finger. He didn't pull it down. "She wore that the day we moved into our first apartment," he said. His voice was quiet, the rasp gone, replaced by a hollow, melodic grief. "She said it made her feel like a French film star. I told her she looked better than any of them." Maya didn't breathe. This was the first time he had spoken of her, not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as a person who liked French films and wore silk scarves in the rain. "She had good taste," Maya whispered. Caleb looked at Maya then. The coldness was still there, but it was thinner, like ice in the spring. He looked at the linen bandages on her hands. "The salve," he said. "It works better if you don't overwork the skin for a few hours." "I have to finish the library, Caleb. If the humidity stays high, the remaining shelves will warp." "The shelves have been warping for 20 years, Caleb said, turning toward the pantry. They can wait until the afternoon. Eat something. You look like a ghost." He disappeared into the pantry, the door swinging shut behind him. It wasn't a conversation, but it was a bridge. A small, fragile thing, but it was holding. Later that afternoon, the weight of the brass key in Maya's pocket became unbearable. Caleb was in the basement, the rhythmic thump-thump of his hammer echoing through the floorboards. He was replacing a support post, a task that would keep him occupied for hours. Maya slipped out the side door. She followed the map she had reconstructed in her head from the Polaroid. The grounds were a labyrinth of overgrown brambles and salt-stunted pines. The wind from the Atlantic was biting, carrying the spray from the waves that crashed against the cliffs below. She pushed through a thicket of dead raspberry bushes, the thorns catching on her sweater. She felt like an explorer in a forgotten world. The further she went from the house, the more the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of decay. It was the silence of waiting. Then she saw it, a wall of gray stone almost entirely obscured by ivy. In the center was a wrought iron gate, its bars twisted into the shapes of lilies and vines. The lock was a heavy, rusted mechanism, a gaping mouth waiting for a meal. Maya pulled out the key. Her hands, softened by the salve, felt more dexterous as she slid the brass into the iron. The key didn't turn at first. She leaned her weight into it, her shoulder pressing against the cold stone. "Please," she thought. "Evelyn, let me in." With a sharp, metallic crack, the bolt threw. The gate swung inward with a long, mournful shriek that startled a flock of gulls from the cliffs. Maya stepped through. The garden was a tomb of beauty. In the center stood the stone gazebo from the photograph, its roof collapsed, but its pillars still standing like sentinels. The hydrangeas had grown into massive, woody skeletons, their dried flower heads rattling in the wind like parchment. But it wasn't the plants that caught Maya's eye. It was the small stone structure at the far end of the garden, a garden house no larger than a shed, built with the same architectural precision as the manor. She walked toward it, her boots sinking into the thick carpet of moss. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of old paper and dried herbs. A desk sat under a window that looked out over the sea. And on that desk, arranged in a neat, purposeful row, were 7 leather-bound journals. Maya picked up the first one. The cover was embossed with a single word: Restorations. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, the spindly, elegant script of Evelyn Blackwood. June 12th. I saw the girl today, at the store. She thinks she is invisible, but I see the way she looks at the foundations of things. She looks at the world and sees the cracks. She is like me. She is a builder who has forgotten how to build. Maya's breath caught. She flipped through the pages, her eyes skimming the dates. August 4th. Caleb came to the cliffs again. He stands so close to the edge. He thinks he is looking at the water, but he is looking for a way back to a world that doesn't exist anymore. He is a man made of wood, strong but brittle if the frost gets in. October 20th. I have made my decision. The law says the house must go to my kin, but my kin are vultures. They would tear these walls down for the profit of the stone. No, this house needs the broken. It needs people who know that a crack doesn't mean the end. It means the light can get in. Maya sat on the floor, the journal heavy in her lap. Evelyn hadn't chosen them by accident. She hadn't left them the house out of a random act of kindness. She had engineered this cohabitation. She had seen 2 people drowning in the same river and decided to give them a single raft. I am leaving them the library and the hall, the final entry read. If they can fix the rooms where stories live and where people gather, perhaps they can fix the rooms inside themselves. But they must do it together. One cannot hold the ladder while the other climbs if there is no trust. And trust is the hardest thing to build when the ground is still shaking. Maya closed the book. She looked out the window at the ocean. The waves were relentless, eroding the cliff inch by inch. She realized then that Evelyn had known the truth. The house wouldn't last forever. The sea would eventually take Blackwood Manor. The goal wasn't to save the building, the goal was to save the people inside it. When Maya returned to the house, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, turning the sky into a palette of bruised plums and oranges. She found Caleb in his workshop, a small room off the kitchen that he had claimed as his own. He was working on a piece of mahogany, the shavings curling off the wood like ribbons of dark silk. The room was lit by a single, focused lamp, casting the rest of the space into deep shadow. Maya stood in the doorway watching him. He didn't see her. He was leaning over the wood, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He moved with a grace that was entirely different from his movements in the rest of the house. Here, he wasn't a widower or a survivor. He was a creator. She watched the way his hands moved. They were steady, sure. He didn't fight the wood. He listened to it. He followed the grain, adjusting the pressure of his plane with a sensitivity that made Maya's chest ache. "You're staring," Caleb said, not looking up. "It's beautiful," Maya said. "What is it?" "A replacement for the library's banister. The original was white oak, but the rot had gone too deep. Mahogany handles the salt air better. It's more resilient." "Resilient," Maya repeated the word, tasting it. Caleb finally looked up. The lamplight hit the sweat on his forehead, the silver in his beard. He saw the way she was looking at the wood, and for a second, the hostility vanished. "Wood is like people," he said, turning back to the bench. "If you force it to go against its grain, it'll eventually splinter. You have to find the path it wants to take. Even if it's been warped by the rain, there's usually a straight line somewhere inside it. You just have to be patient enough to find it." Maya walked into the room, stopping just outside his personal space. The smell of cedar was overwhelming. "I found the garden, Caleb," she said softly. The plane stopped mid-stroke. Caleb's shoulders tensed. "I found Evelyn's journals," she continued. "She wrote about us, before she died. She knew who we were." Caleb didn't move. The silence in the workshop grew heavy, the smell of the mahogany suddenly cloying. "I don't care what a dead woman wrote in a book," Caleb said, his voice returning to its granite rasp. "She wanted us to heal, Caleb. She knew about the bridge. She knew about Sarah." At the mention of the name, Caleb spun around. He dropped the plane, the tool clattering onto the floor with a sound like a gunshot. He stepped toward her, his face inches from hers. The heat coming off him was a physical force. "You don't talk about healing," he hissed. "You don't get to use her name to make yourself feel better about what you did. You think this house is a fairy tale? You think we're going to fix a few shelves and suddenly the world is right again? My wife is at the bottom of a river, Maya, and you're the one who put her there." "I didn't," Maya shouted, the words tearing out of her throat. "I told them, Caleb. I sent the memos. I flagged the missing column 3 times. They ignored me. They threatened to fire me." "And you stayed," Caleb roared. "You stayed and you signed the papers and you let the cars drive onto that bridge. You chose your career over her life." "I chose to try and fix it from the inside," she screamed back, tears finally spilling over. "I thought if I stayed I could force them to reinforce it. If I quit, they would have just hired someone who wouldn't say anything at all." They stood there, both of them gasping for air, the air between them vibrating with the force of their shared agony. Caleb's eyes were wild, the pupils blown wide. He looked like a man who was finally seeing the enemy, and realizing the enemy was just as broken as he was. Maya reached out, her bandaged hand grasping his arm. She didn't think about it. It was an instinct, a desperate attempt to ground them both. "I am so sorry," she sobbed. "I wake up every morning and I wish it had been me. I wish I had been on that bridge and she had been home. I would give anything to trade places." Caleb stared at her hand on his arm. He looked at the white linen, the way it was stained with the mahogany dust. He didn't pull away. For a long, agonizing minute, he just stood there, his breath hitching in his chest. Then slowly, he reached up and covered her hand with his own. His hand was hot, rough, and so heavy it felt like it might crush her. He didn't squeeze. He just held it there. "I know," he whispered. The 3 words were more devastating than any shout. They were an admission of his own knowledge, his own complicity in the hatred he had used to keep himself upright. He let go of her arm and turned back to his workbench. He didn't look at her again. "Go wash your face," he said, his voice flat. "The contractors are coming tomorrow. We need to be ready." The next morning, the us versus them shift happened with the arrival of a sleek black SUV. It parked at the edge of the driveway, the engine idling with a low, expensive purr. 2 men stepped out. They were wearing tailored coats and carried leather portfolios, the predators of the corporate world, come to survey the carcass of Blackwood Manor. Maya and Caleb were on the porch. Caleb was holding a crowbar. Maya was holding a stack of blueprints she had pulled from her own luggage, the original designs for the manor's structural restoration that she had been working on in secret. "Mr. Vance? Ms. Thorne?" the lead man asked, his smile as fake as the polished chrome on his car. "I'm Mr. Sterling from Vantage Developments. We're here to discuss the buyout offer. I'm sure you've realized by now that this structure is beyond salvation." Caleb stepped forward, the crowbar glinting in the sun. "The structure is fine. It's the people outside it I'm worried about." Sterling laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Caleb, let's be realistic. The cost of bringing this place up to code is more than the land is worth. And given Ms. Thorne's history with structural integrity, I'm surprised she hasn't suggested you just let it fall into the sea." Maya felt the familiar coldness of the public shame wash over her. But then, she felt a weight on her shoulder. Caleb had placed his hand there. It was a solid, grounding presence. "Actually," Maya said, her voice clear and resonant, "the Maine Coastal Preservation Act, Section 4B, states that any structure over 100 years old with a documented history of architectural significance is protected from eminent domain for the purposes of commercial development. And this house is currently under a federally recognized restoration mandate." She stepped forward, opening the blueprints. "I've already filed the preliminary stabilization reports with the county. The house isn't decaying, it's being renewed. And according to the terms of Evelyn Blackwood's will, this property cannot be sold until the 6-month cohabitation period is complete. So, you can take your portfolios and your SUV, and you can get off our land." Sterling's smile vanished. He looked at Maya, then at Caleb, who was now standing with his arms crossed, looking like a mountain that had no intention of moving. "You're making a mistake," Sterling said. "This house is a money pit. It will bury you both." "We're already buried," Caleb said. "We're just digging our way out." The SUV peeled away, gravel spraying from its tires. Maya and Caleb stood on the porch, watching the dust settle. The silence between them was different now. It was the silence of allies. "Section 4B?" Caleb asked, looking at her. "I made it up," Maya admitted, her face flushing. "But he doesn't know that. And by the time his lawyers check, I'll have the actual paperwork filed." Caleb looked at her for a long time. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't a full smile. It was too tired for that. But it was there. "You're a dangerous woman, Maya Thorne." "I'm an architect, Caleb. I know how to find the weak points." That evening, they did something they hadn't done in the 3 weeks they had been there. They ate dinner together. It was a simple meal, soup from a can and bread they had bought at the hardware store. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm, golden glow over the scarred wood. The rain was falling outside, a soft, rhythmic drizzle that pattered against the windows. It wasn't a storm, it was just the weather. "Tell me about the missing column," Caleb said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his soup. But the question wasn't an accusation. It was a request. Maya took a deep breath. She told him. She told him about the night she had found the error in the contractor's math. She told him about the meeting where she had been shouted down. She told him about the anonymous letter she had tried to send to the press and how it had been intercepted by the firm's security. She told him everything, and as she spoke, she felt the weight she had been carrying, the phantom bridge, begin to dissolve. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. When she was finished, He reached out and pushed the bread toward her. Evelyn was right, he said. About what? About the cracks. You can't fix a house if you're pretending the foundation is solid. You have to see the holes before you can fill them. He stood up and walked to the drying rack. He picked up Sarah's scarf, which was now dry and soft. He didn't look at it with the same raw agony he had that morning. He folded it carefully with a reverence that was quiet and final. I'm going to finish the library banister tonight, he said. I'll need you to hold the light. I'll be there, Maya said. As Caleb walked out of the room, Maya looked at the empty chair where he had been sitting. The house groaned, a long, settling sound that felt like a sigh. They weren't healed. They weren't in love. They were two broken people standing in a broken house, holding on to each other so they didn't fall. But as Maya followed him into the library, she realized that for the first time in years she wasn't looking for the exit. She was looking at the grain of the wood. The thaw had begun. And beneath the ice, something was finally starting to grow. The night the banister was finally set was a night of stagnant air and low tide. The ocean, usually a roar that filled the gaps in their thoughts, had retreated into a distant, rhythmic hiss. Inside the library of Blackwood Manor, the silence was no longer a weapon. It was a workshop. Maya held the work light, its yellow cord snaking across the scarred floorboards. The beam was focused on the new mahogany rail, a deep, reddish-brown spine that Caleb had spent the last 3 days carving. It was smooth, sanded down to a finish that looked like liquid velvet. Steady, Caleb muttered. He was kneeling at the top of the spiral staircase, positioning the first joint. He was close enough that Maya could feel the heat radiating from his shoulder. She could smell the sawdust on his skin and the sharp medicinal scent of the salve she had rubbed into his knuckles earlier that evening. It's catching on the lower bracket, Maya said, leaning in. She didn't think about the proximity. She didn't think about the fact that her hair was brushing against his arm. She was an architect looking at a structural misalignment. You need to rotate it 2 degrees clockwise. The original post wasn't plumb. Caleb paused. He looked at the bracket, then at her. The lamplight caught the gold in his eyes that weren't searching for a villain anymore. How did you see that? He asked. I spent 4 years studying how things fail, Caleb, she said softly. You start to recognize the lean before it happens. Caleb adjusted the wood. It slid into place with a satisfying, solid thunk. He began to drive the brass screws home, his movements precise and rhythmic. I used to build these with my father, Caleb said, his voice low, blending with the sound of the screwdriver. In a shop in Vermont, he told me that a staircase is the most honest part of a house. You can't lie to a staircase. If your math is off, the whole world feels it under their feet. My father was a gardener, Maya shared. It was the first piece of her before life she had offered him. He used to say the same thing about foundations. If you don't respect the dirt, the flowers will eventually tell everyone your secrets. Caleb finished the last screw. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He reached out and ran his palm along the length of the mahogany. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, not with her, but with the work. It's solid, he said. It's more than solid, Caleb. It's beautiful. He looked at her, and the ghost in the room suddenly stepped between them. On the mantel behind them sat the cornflower scarf, neatly folded. It was a quiet reminder that every moment of beauty they shared was built on a foundation of wreckage. Caleb's expression didn't harden this time, but it shadowed. He looked at the scarf, then back at Maya. Evelyn has a wine cellar, he said abruptly. Behind the pantry, I found a bottle of Bordeaux from 1990. It's older than you were when you started at that firm. A celebration? Maya asked. A truce, Caleb corrected. They sat in the kitchen, the only room in the house that felt remotely like a home. The single lamp on the table cast a circle of warmth that didn't quite reach the dark, empty corners of the ceiling. The wine was dark, the color of a bruised plum. Caleb poured 2 glasses, the sound of the liquid hitting the crystal the only noise in the room. To the banister, Maya said, raising her glass. To the housing, Caleb replied. They drank in silence for a long time. The wine was complex, earthy, sharp, and lingering. It was the kind of wine that forced you to slow down, to notice the passage of time. Maya watched Caleb over the rim of her glass. He was wearing an old sweater, the wool pilled at the elbows. He looked tired, not the sharp, jagged exhaustion of grief, but a deep structural fatigue. "Why did you stay, Caleb?" she asked. "In the city, I mean. After the bridge, I saw the news. They offered you a settlement, a large one." Caleb stared into his wine. "I didn't want their blood money. I stayed because I thought if I left, she'd be truly gone. I lived in that apartment for 2 years, smelling her perfume on the curtains, waiting for the door to open. I thought if I was miserable enough, the universe might realize it made a mistake and send her back." He looked up at her, his gaze piercing. "But you didn't take the money either. I checked the public records during the 2nd month. Your name wasn't on the list of people who accepted the confidential resolution." Maya looked down at her hands. They were calloused now, the skin stained with wood tint. "I couldn't take it," she whispered. "The firm offered me $500,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They wanted my silence more than they wanted my expertise. If I took that money, I was agreeing that Sarah's life had a price tag. I was agreeing that my silence was for sale. So what did you do?" "I gave it to the victims' fund," she said. "Anonymously. I kept just enough to pay for my mother's medical bills before she passed. Then I moved to the city and took a job at a data entry firm." Caleb's glass hit the table with a sharp clack. He leaned forward, his eyes searching hers for the lie. "You've been living on nothing," he realized. He looked at her boots. The soles were worn thin, the leather cracked. He looked at her thin coat hanging on the peg by the door. "For 3 years you've been punishing yourself." "I thought it was the only thing I had left to give," she said. "If I couldn't give her her life back, I could at least give up mine." The ghost in the room didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a shared witness. Caleb reached across the table. His hand stopped inches from hers, hovering in the warm light. He didn't touch her, but the air between them vibrated with the weight of the gesture. "We're both idiots, Maya," he said, his voice thick. "We've been trying to build a memorial out of our own bones." He finally closed the gap. His fingers touched the back of her hand, a light tentative pressure. It wasn't a romantic touch. It was the touch of one survivor checking the pulse of another. Maya's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin was the first real thing she had felt in years that didn't hurt. "Who were you, Maya?" he asked. "Before the blueprints and the bridges? What did you want?" "I wanted to build a library," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "A real one, with a glass roof and trees growing inside. I wanted to build places where people felt safe. I wanted to be the person who made the world feel solid. And now? Now I just want to finish this house. I want to see the garden in bloom. I want to know that something can grow in this soil again." Caleb squeezed her hand, a brief, firm pressure before he pulled back. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. "Sterling called me today," he said, his back to her. The mention of the contractor was like a bucket of ice water. "What did he want?" "He didn't want to talk about the buyout. He wanted to talk about you. He sent me a file, a copy of a memo you supposedly wrote to the board of directors 2 weeks before the collapse." Maya felt a cold pit open in her stomach. "I wrote dozens of memos, Caleb." "This one was different," Caleb said, turning around. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "This one says that you were the one who suggested the structural efficiencies. It says you were the one who recommended removing the secondary support column to save 3% on the budget." "That's a lie," Maya gasped, her voice failing her. "Caleb, I would never—" "I know," Caleb interrupted. He walked back to the table and laid the paper down. "I know it's a lie because I've spent the last month watching you work. I've seen the way you look at a joint. I've seen the way you refuse to move on until the foundation is perfect." He looked at the paper with a look of pure disgust. They forged it, Maya. They forged it 3 years ago to protect themselves, and Sterling's using it now to try and break us apart. He thinks if I hate you enough, I'll take his money just to get away from you. Maya picked up the paper. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like hers. The professional tone, the technical language. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. "He's watching us," she whispered, her eyes darting to the dark windows. "Let him watch," Caleb said, his jaw setting. "Let him see that we're still here. But we have to be careful, Maya. He's not just trying to buy the land anymore, he's trying to destroy what's left of our names." "Why?" Maya asked. "Why go to this much trouble for one decaying house?" "Because it's not just a house," a new voice said. Maya and Caleb both spun around. The lawyer, Ms. Thorne, was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She was drenched, her raincoat dripping onto the floor, her face pale in the lamplight. "How did you get in?" Caleb demanded. "The side door was unlocked," she said, her voice trembling. "I drove from the city. I couldn't call. My phone was, compromised." She walked to the table, her eyes flitting between the wine glasses and the forged memo. "Evelyn didn't leave you this house because she liked you," the lawyer said, her voice a harsh whisper. "She left you this house because she found the evidence. She was a majority shareholder in the firm that insured the St. Jude's Bridge. She had the original unredacted safety audits. She had the proof that the board of directors and Sterling's development group knew the bridge was going to fail 6 months before it did." The room went cold. Maya looked at the library, where they had been working so diligently to save the wood and the glass. "Where is it?" Caleb asked. "Where's the proof?" "It's in the house," the lawyer said. "Evelyn told me she hid it in the one place no one would ever look, the one place that requires 2 people to find." She looked at Maya, then at Caleb. "You've been restoring the library. You've been looking at the shelves and the banisters, but have you looked at the center of the room? Have you looked at the missing column?" Maya felt the air leave her lungs. She thought of the library's design. It was a perfect octagon except for the center, where a massive decorative mahogany pillar stood, ostensibly holding up the mezzanine. "The pillar," Maya whispered. "It's not structural. I noticed it when we were doing the water damage. It's too large for the load it's carrying." "It's not a pillar," the lawyer said. "It's a safe, and the combination isn't a number, it's a weight." The 3 of them stood in the library. The storm was beginning to return, the wind howling through the rafters they had only just secured. The mahogany pillar stood in the center of the room, majestic and immovable. "A weight?" Caleb asked, his hand resting on the wood. "Evelyn's will had a codicil I wasn't allowed to reveal until the midpoint of your stay," the lawyer explained. "She said that truth weighs exactly as much as 2 souls. She was a poet, but she was also an engineer's wife." Maya looked at the base of the pillar. She saw it now, the faint hairline seam in the floorboards. The entire pillar was sitting on a pressure plate. "It needs 2 people," Maya said, her mind racing. "It needs the weight of 2 people standing on opposite sides of the base, applied simultaneously." Caleb looked at her. The ghost was there again, but this time it felt like it was urging them forward. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she replied. They stepped onto the base of the pillar. For a second, nothing happened. The house groaned, the wind lashed the glass, and the silence of the library seemed to thicken. Then there was a sound, a deep, mechanical grind of gears that hadn't moved in decades. The pillar didn't move, but a section of the floorboards at their feet slid back, revealing a small steel box bolted to the foundation of the house. Caleb knelt down. He reached into the dark space and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He opened it. Inside were the original blueprints for the St. Jude's Bridge, but these weren't the ones Maya had seen. These were marked with red ink. Danger. Structural failure imminent. Recommended closure, immediately. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a signature. Not Maya's. It was Sterling's. He hadn't just been the contractor. He had been the consultant who signed off on the efficiencies while knowing they were lethal. Maya felt a wave of nausea. He knew. He knew the whole time. He didn't just know. Caleb said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He profited from it. The buyout of the firm, the resort development, it was all funded by the insurance payout from the bridge. Caleb looked at the lawyer. Why tell us now? Why wait? Because Sterling found out I had the codicil, the lawyer said. He's on his way here. He's not coming for the house anymore, Caleb. He's coming for the folder. As if on cue, the sound of a high-powered engine roared up the driveway. Headlights swept across the library windows, casting long, frantic shadows against the shelves. Caleb stood up, the folder gripped in his hand. He looked at Maya. The slow thaw was over. The heat of the truth was here. Maya, he said, his voice steady. Go to the kitchen. Get the emergency bag. Meet me at the side door. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish the restoration, he said, his eyes hard. I'm going to make sure the foundation of this house is the only thing left standing. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and headed for the foyer, his heavy boots sounding like thunder on the new floorboards. Maya stood in the center of the library, the ghost of Sarah Vance suddenly feeling very, very close. She looked at the folder, then at the door. The midpoint had been reached. The secret was out, and the House of Broken Things was about to become a battlefield. The storm did not end with a sudden burst of sunlight. It ended in a slow gray exhaustion, the wind tapering off into a rhythmic sigh that mirrored the receding tide. In the cab of Caleb's truck, the heater groaned, pushing a thin stream of lukewarm air against their shivering legs. Outside, the world was a study in wreckage, branches strewn across the driveway, the ocean still churning with white-capped rage, and Blackwood Manor standing tall, though scarred, against the morning mist. Maya sat with a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her fingers numb as she watched the condensation crawl down the windshield. Caleb sat beside her, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if he were still driving through the eye of the hurricane. The leather folder sat on the dashboard between them, its presence heavier than all the stone in the house combined. Read it, Maya whispered. Caleb didn't move for a long time. Then, with a hand that shook so slightly it was almost imperceptible, he reached for the folder. He didn't look at the audits this time. He didn't look at Sterling's forged signatures or the red-inked warnings. He flipped to the very back where a small ivory envelope had been tucked into a hidden sleeve. His name was written on the front in a script that was light, airy, and unmistakably Sarah's. Caleb's breath hitched, a sharp, jagged sound that seemed to catch on the very air in the cabin. He broke the seal with a reverence that made Maya look away, giving him the privacy of his grief. The silence in the truck stretched, filled only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of paper unfolding. Caleb, the letter began, though Maya could only hear it in the way Caleb's posture suddenly softened. If you're reading this, it means the truth finally caught up to the lies. I saw you looking at the blueprints that night, Caleb. I saw the way you worried about the missing lines. You always said a building is only as good as the honesty of its builder. Please don't spend your life looking for me in the wreckage. The bridge was a mistake made by men who forgot that numbers represent people. But you are a man who remembers. Build something new, Caleb. Not a monument to what we lost, but a roof for someone who needs to be found. Caleb let out a long, shuddering exhale. He folded the letter and pressed it against his forehead. His eyes closed. For the first time, he wasn't fighting the memory. He was letting it hold him. She knew, he whispered. She knew the risks, and she stayed because she believed in the work I was doing. She didn't blame the lines on the paper, Maya. She blamed the silence. He turned to look at her. The blood from the cut on his forehead had dried, leaving a dark streak across his temple. He looked at Maya's bandaged hands, then at the house. Sterling is done, he said, his voice regaining its structural integrity. The lawyer has the audits. The firm will be liquidated. Your name, people are going to know the truth, Maya. They're going to know you were the one shouting into the wind. It doesn't change the bridge, Caleb, she said softly. No, he agreed, his gaze steady on hers. But it changes the house. 3 months later, the air in Oakhaven had shifted from the biting chill of winter to the salt-sweet promise of a Maine spring. Maya stood in the center of the ballroom, her boots clicking against the newly polished floorboards. The room was massive, the ceiling vaulted and intricate, but it was no longer a tomb of Victorian dust. The light poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the ocean and casting dancing, watery patterns across the walls. The ballroom hadn't been restored to its original, pristine state. Instead, they had practiced a philosophy Maya had stumbled upon in her architectural studies, kintsugi for buildings. Where the mezzanine had collapsed and the beams had splintered, they hadn't hidden the damage. Caleb had used a clear, high-strength resin mixed with powdered brass to fill the cracks in the mahogany pillars. The result was a series of golden lightning bolts running through the wood, beautiful, deliberate scars that told the story of the storm and the survival. The inspector just left, Caleb said, walking into the room. He looked different now. He was still the same man of granite and cedar, but the shadows under his eyes had retreated. He was wearing a clean shirt, and his beard was trimmed, though his hands remained the hands of a worker. And? Maya asked, her heart fluttering. The structure is certified, he said, a genuine smile, the first she had seen, breaking across his face. Blackwood Manor is no longer a condemnation risk. It's officially a sanctuary. He walked toward her, stopping just at the edge of her space. The ballroom felt vast around them, but the intimacy between them was a tight, focused thing. The first group arrives next week, Maya said, looking at the schedule on her tablet. 6 survivors of the bridge collapse. They're coming for the first restoration retreat. We have the library ready and the garden is... The garden is beautiful, Maya, Caleb interrupted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key, the one she had found under the floorboards months ago. He took her hand and pressed the key into her palm. Evelyn knew exactly what she was doing, he said. She didn't give us a house to fix, she gave us a house that would fix us. Maya looked at the key, then up at him. The ghost in the room wasn't Sarah anymore, and it wasn't the tragedy. It was the future. It was the realization that they had built a foundation out of the very things they thought would destroy them. The 180 days are up today, Maya realized. The lawyer is coming with the final papers. We could leave, Caleb. We could take our shares and go back to the city. You could have a new shop. I could go back to a firm. Caleb looked around the ballroom, the golden cracks in the wood, the light on the sea, the space they had carved out of the rot. I'm already where I need to be, he said. He didn't make a grand declaration of love. He didn't have to. The way he looked at her was the look of a man who had finally found the straight line inside the warped wood. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering on her cheek. Stay, Maya, he whispered. The garden still needs a lot of work, and I don't think I can hold the ladder by myself anymore. Maya leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she felt the solid, grounding warmth of his skin. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. The final cinematic shot would see them standing at the edge of the cliff as the sun began to set. The house stood behind them, its windows glowing with a warm amber light, a beacon on the jagged coast. In the distance, the new bridge was being built, a structure of modern steel and glass, designed with the transparency and integrity Maya had fought for. But they weren't looking at the bridge. They were looking at each other. The inheritance of broken things was no longer a burden. It was a gift. They had deconstructed their grief, brick by brick, and used the rubble to build a home that understood the value of a crack. As the first stars began to pierce the purple twilight of Maine, Caleb and Maya turned and walked back toward the house together. They didn't walk as ghosts. They walked as builders. The door to Blackwood Manor clicked shut behind them, not with a groan and not with a shriek, but with the solid, certain sound of a house that finally knew who it belonged to.